My name is Olivia Harper. I'm 31 years old, and the night my mother decided I had no home left was the same night I stepped off a plane, feeling like my life was finally coming together. I'd just wrapped a 3-day business trip in Denver, closed the biggest deal my team had seen all quarter, and for once, I wasn't dreading coming back to Oregon. Waiting for me in Riverview was the old cedar-shingled house my grandmother left me, the only place that had ever felt completely safe. There was also our annual family get-together, the loud backyard kind, with folding chairs and potato salad, the kind I grew up believing meant we were all on the same side. I landed tired but proud, clutching my laptop bag in one hand and a bakery box with my grandmother's favorite lemon cake in the other, thinking I was walking back into a weekend of comfort. By the time the sun went down that day, I'd be standing on a porch I legally owned, staring at a message from my mother that said, "Locks changed. You have no home," and realizing I'd never really understood what family meant to her. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against your own family, even when it broke your heart a little. I grew up in a house where we were always told that family mattered more than anything, even when the way we treated each other didn't always match that slogan. My parents, Karen and Mark Harper, worked hard enough to keep us comfortable, but not extravagant. Dad put in his years as a mechanic, and Mom bounced between office jobs and volunteer committees that came with name tags and potlucks. We weren't poor, but there was always a quiet awareness of what we couldn't afford, the vacations. We didn't take the big repairs that had to wait. My older brother Brian learned early how to charm our mother, how to make her laugh and lean in his direction, and I learned how to stay useful and quiet, especially when money or appearances were on the table. Somewhere along the way, being a good daughter became less about who I was, and more about how willing I was to go along with what made her look good. The one person who didn't ask me to be anything but myself was my grandmother, my dad's mother, Margaret. Everyone called her Maggie, but to me she was simply Grandma, the soft-spoken anchor on the edge of town in that weathered cedar house near the river. Her place smelled like lemon soap, and old books with floors that creaked and windows that stuck in the winter, and I loved every inch of it. When I was a teenager, I spent more weekends there than at home learning how to braid my hair in her bathroom mirror or sitting at her kitchen table, while she told stories about Harper women who got through hard times by being steady, not loud. She didn't have much money either, but she had this way of making a cup of tea feel like a small ceremony, like your feelings were worth sitting down for. Where my mother saw obligations and appearances, my grandmother saw people. By the time I finished college and started building a career in finance, the difference between my grandmother's world and my mother's ambitions had become sharp. I worked my way into a good firm in Portland, bought a used car that rattled on the highway, and still drove back to Riverview every few weeks just to sit in that faded parlor and listen to the river at night. My parents lived in a smaller, newer house across town, neat siding and white blinds in every window, the kind of place my mother could show off to guests. She never said it out loud, but it wasn't hard to tell she thought my grandmother's house was old-fashioned, more burden than treasure. When Grandma's health began to fail, I was the one who drove her to appointments, sorted her paperwork, and stayed overnight when the stairs became too much. Karen stopped by with casseroles and lists of things that needed updating if the house was ever going to be worth anything. When my grandmother passed, the reading of her will was the first time the gap between what we said about family and how we lived, it opened up all the way. I remember sitting in the attorney's office, hands folded in my lap, expecting maybe a piece of jewelry or a box of recipes, something small and sentimental. Instead, the lawyer cleared his throat and announced that the Riverview house, the land it sat on, and all its contents were being left to me alone. Not to my father, not to my mother, not split between the kids, but to my granddaughter Olivia, who sees the soul of this place and understands what it holds. My father blinked back tears. My brother stared at the floor. My mother's smile turned thin as paper in a matter of seconds. Later she insisted she was just surprised, but there was a new stiffness in the way she hugged me by the car, like I'd taken something from her instead of receiving a gift. In the months that followed, I did what I thought any grateful granddaughter would do. I took care of what she'd entrusted to me. I refinanced my car to free up extra money for plumbing repairs, spent weekends scraping, peeling paint off the porch railings, and learned more about property taxes than I ever wanted to know. I kept the creaky floors and the glass jars of wildflowers in the windows, but I also patched the roof and replaced the worst of the drafty windows so the house would last. I told my parents over and over that it was still a home for all of us, that they were welcome whenever they wanted to come by for dinner, that nothing about our relationship had to change just because my name was on the deed. My father would nod and say it was nice to see the place coming back to life. My mother would glance around and make comments like, "Well, your grandmother liked that wallpaper," or "This house has always been for the family, not just one person," and then fall strangely quiet. Little things began to stand out once I stopped being so eager to smooth them over. There were low conversations at holiday dinners that ached with the sound of my name. A couple of times I caught my mother and Brian lowering their voices when I walked into the room, papers disappearing into a folder or a purse a little too quickly. Mom suddenly became very interested in the details of the will and the title, asking whether I'd ever thought about selling or putting things in all our names just to make it easier. She'd make those remarks right after bringing up the rising cost of utilities or the tax bill, as if the house was a problem I'd created by inheriting it. I told myself she just needed time to adjust, that grief was making all of us act differently, and that keeping the peace was more important than calling out every strange look. But under all of that, something had shifted. The house that had once felt like a shared refuge was starting to feel like a line drawn in quiet, invisible ink. So when that spring rolled around and Uncle Tom announced he'd be hosting the big family gathering at his place just outside town, I decided to lean into the old traditions and hope the tension would ease. I booked my flight to Denver for work, packed my blazer and heels, and arranged to fly back in time to stop by the house, change into something more casual, and bring my grandmother's favorite lemon cake to the party. As the plane descended into Oregon, I pressed my forehead lightly against the window and pictured the cedar siding catching the late afternoon sun, the chipped mailbox with my grandmother's handwriting still faded on the side, and the porch light I always left on if I knew I'd be coming home after dark. What I didn't know was that while I was up there in the clouds feeling proud and tired and ready for a weekend that finally felt normal, someone else down on the ground had already decided that when I walked up to that porch, I wouldn't be walking into my home anymore. I pulled into Riverview just after noon, expecting to make a quick stop at the house before heading to Uncle Tom's place. The sun was bright on the front steps, the same steps I had painted the summer before, but something about the stillness around the porch made me pause before I even got out of the car. I told myself it was travel fatigue, that strange emptiness a person feels after stepping off a plane, but the closer I walked, the heavier that feeling became. My suitcase wheels clicked against the walk, the lemon cake box balanced in my hand, and for a moment everything looked exactly like I'd left it, until I slid my key into the lock and felt nothing but metal grinding against metal. I tried again with my spare key, turning it slowly, pressing my palm against the doorframe the way I'd done when the lock stuck in cold weather. But it was no use. Something was different, something purposeful, and the longer I stood there pressing my thumb against the cool brass, the clearer that truth became. My first instinct was to call my mother. It rang twice before going to voicemail, her recorded voice, cutting off abruptly at the end, like she'd never bothered finishing the greeting. I called Brian next, listening to the echo of the unanswered ring while the quiet street settled around me. A neighbor's wind chime swayed in the breeze, and I could smell cut grass from down the block, but there was no sign of anyone from my own family. I tried my mother one more time, pressing the phone to my ear while staring at the deadbolt that had been on that door for as long as I could remember. This new one was thicker, a brushed steel model with a keypad at the top. Nothing like the older lock my grandmother had chosen because it felt like home. The call dropped to voicemail again. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear and leaned in to get a closer look at the numbers on the keypad. A sinking feeling moving through me in one slow, steady wave. That was when my phone buzzed. The message preview lit up across the screen, a single line that seemed to still the entire afternoon around me. Locks changed. You have no home. There was no greeting, no explanation, and no attempt at softening the words. Underneath the message was my mother's name spelled out plainly, as if she had simply sent a grocery reminder. I stared at the text, my thumb hovering just above the screen. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether the tightness in my throat came from shock or something else entirely. The lemon cake felt heavier in my hand. A car passed by slowly, but the driver didn't look in my direction. The house stood there unchanged in every visible way, yet completely different now that I knew I wasn't supposed to walk inside. I didn't reply to the message. Instead, I stepped back from the porch and walked toward my car, each step feeling careful and measured, like I was moving through a space that no longer recognized me. The keys in my hand jingled softly, a sound that usually reminded me of arriving home, yet now it felt out of place. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, the cake box settling onto the passenger seat. The street looked the same as it always had, the maple trees arching overhead and casting patches of light across the pavement, but I felt like I had slipped into a scene I no longer belonged to. I backed out of the driveway, slowly turning away from the house and onto the main road, unsure where I was going but knowing I couldn't sit in front of the porch any longer. I drove without a destination, letting the miles pass under the tires while the message replayed in my mind. I didn't try to call my mother again, and I didn't reach out to anyone in the family. The radio stayed off. The sky shifted from blue to hazy gold, and I realized the sun was beginning to set as I pulled into the gravel lot of a small diner just off the highway. I sat there for a moment before leaning forward, resting my forehead lightly against the steering wheel, the quiet thrum of the engine filling the space where words should have been. After a minute, I reached for my phone and called Jenna. She answered on the first ring, her voice immediate and steady. I didn't explain everything, only said that something was wrong and I needed a place to go. She told me to come over, no questions asked. By the time I reached her apartment, dusk had settled across the sky. She opened the door before I even knocked, her expression calm but concerned. I walked inside, still holding the lemon cake, and as soon as she wrapped her arms around me, the tension I'd been holding seemed to loosen all at once. I hadn't cried in a long time, not like that, not in front of anyone, but the moment I felt the warmth of her home, the soft lighting, the faint scent of herbal tea, the simple comfort of someone waiting for me, I felt my eyes sting. She guided me to the couch and let me sit without pressing for details. The cake box rested on her kitchen counter, untouched, like a piece of another life I had carried with me without thinking. After a while, when the room had grown quiet, Jenna asked what had happened. I told her everything I knew, which wasn't much. The lock, the unanswered calls, the text. She listened without interrupting, her expression steady as she folded her hands in her lap. When I finished, she let out a quiet breath and said, "That wasn't an accident." Her tone wasn't sharp or angry. It was simply matter of fact, the kind of clarity that settled gently rather than cutting through. I nodded, though the words were still difficult to form. The rest of the night passed slowly. She set up the pull-out couch in the living room and made sure I had a blanket that didn't scratch and a glass of water nearby. When she went to bed, the apartment fell into a soft, restful stillness, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment I had stepped onto my porch. By morning, I was running on little sleep. I quietly folded the blanket and set it at the end of the couch, trying not to wake Jenna as I gathered my belongings. The apartment was still dim when I slipped out the front door and walked toward my car, the early morning air cool against my face. I didn't have a clear plan, only a need to return to the house and see it again in the daylight. The roads were empty, and a thin fog hung low over the river as I turned back toward Riverview. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch looked exactly the same as the day before, but I didn't approach the front door this time. Something drew my attention toward the shrubs on the side of the house, shapes half hidden behind the branches dark against the morning light. I walked closer until the details became clear. 3 large black trash bags sat tucked behind the shrubs, tied loosely at the top, the plastic bulging with the weight of whatever was inside. I knelt beside the first one and pulled the knot open. Shirts, sweaters, jeans. My clothes were stuffed inside without care, wrinkled and pressed together like they had been scooped off the floor. The second bag held my toiletries bottles of shampoo and lotion I recognized from my bathroom shelf, even the mug I used each morning for tea. The third bag held things that stopped me for a moment. Books. A framed picture of me and my grandmother, a small jewelry box, its lid shifted open. Inside was the necklace my grandmother had given me when I graduated from college. It rested on its side among loose postcards and a journal with a torn cover. The driveway was quiet as I stood there, my fingers brushing lightly over the edges of the bag. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere down the street a car door slammed, but the world around me felt muted. I tied the bags closed again, lifted them one by one, and carried them to the car. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't text my mother. I didn't call my brother. Instead, I placed the bags in the back seat, closed the trunk with a soft click, and sat behind the wheel, letting the silence fill the car once more. There was nothing left to say to the people who had put my life in garbage bags and left them outside like forgotten belongings. As I drove away from the house, the morning sunlight moved across the windshield in soft streaks. A part of me knew that whatever had begun on that porch wasn't over. Something deeper had shifted, something I hadn't fully understood yet. I didn't know what would come next, but I could feel it gathering at the edges, waiting to take shape. And I knew I couldn't stay silent much longer. The ride back to Jenna's apartment that morning felt longer than it really was, even though the streets were quiet, and the early light made the town look almost peaceful. I kept glancing at the 3 bags piled in the back seat, the plastic shifting slightly whenever I turned. By the time I reached her building, the weight of everything settled in again, not loud or chaotic, just steady and heavy, in a way that made it difficult to move quickly. I carried the bags up her stairs one at a time, placing them near the wall inside her living room, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at them as if they belonged to someone else. Jenna came out of her bedroom, tying her hair back with one hand, and paused when she saw the bags lined up. She didn't ask what was in them. She only walked over and touched my arm lightly before heading to the kitchen to make coffee. I sat at her small dining table, listening to the faint bubbling of her coffee maker, and opened my laptop with a slow, steady breath. The house, the porch, the bags, they all sat in the back of my mind, but there was something else that pulled my attention now. Months earlier, when my grandmother's estate had been settled, my mother asked me to handle the small memorial fund created in Maggie's honor. It was modest, meant for local nonprofits, and she insisted it was easier for me to manage since I worked in finance. At the time, it felt like a gesture of trust. I organized everything carefully, keeping digital copies of bank statements, receipts, and email threads. I had noticed a few irregularities, small ones, the kind that could slip by without much thought, but I didn't question them then. Now, sitting in Jenna's kitchen with the sunlight moving across the table, I felt a quiet need to look again. I opened the folder I had labeled months ago and scrolled through the files, each document opening with a soft click. There were checks made out to names I didn't recognize, invoices that looked unusual, and explanations from my mother that felt vague in hindsight. One email referenced an upcoming donation that never appeared in the ledger. Another check was made out to someone Brian went to college with, listed as a consultant, even though I knew him as a part-time bartender. I zoomed in on the signature line, recognizing the curve of my mother's handwriting. I sat back slowly, letting the details settle the same way one listens to a distant sound before realizing how close it really is. Jenna placed a cup of coffee beside me and pulled out the chair across from mine. "You're going through the fund records?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She leaned forward, her expression steady. "What are you finding?" I didn't have a simple answer, so I turned the laptop toward her, showing her the latest document. She skimmed it, eyes narrowing slightly as she compared it to the previous page. When she looked back up, there was a calm understanding in her face. She didn't tell me what to do, didn't rush me, only kept her hand resting on her mug, giving me space to continue. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for an attorney I had met at a financial panel the year before. Her name was Elise Park, a woman whose clarity during that event had struck me more than the presentation itself. I hesitated for a moment before pressing call. The line barely rang once before she answered. I explained what had happened at the house, what I had found in the shrubs, and what I was seeing now in the Memorial Fund documents. I stayed close to the facts, steadying my voice as I spoke. Elise listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked a few precise questions. When she spoke again, her tone remained even, but there was no uncertainty. She told me the lockout was illegal because the house was in my name, and removing my belongings without consent was considered unlawful exclusion. She also said that based on the documents I had shared, the memorial fund might need to be reviewed more formally. Jenna watched my face as I listened, her quiet presence grounding me as Elise outlined the next steps. By the time I ended the call, the morning light had shifted across the table, and the coffee in my cup had grown lukewarm. I set the phone down gently and rubbed my thumb over the edge of the mug, the ceramic warm against my skin. Jenna didn't say anything at first. She stood, refilled both of our cups, and returned to her seat. "What now?" she asked softly. I thought for a moment before answering. "She's drawing up a letter," I said, "and an injunction request so I can get back into the house." Jenna nodded, her eyes steady on mine. "Then that's where we start." The rest of that morning moved slowly but with purpose. Elise sent over a draft of the cease and desist letter within an hour, and I reviewed it carefully before sending it back with my approval. She also filed the emergency injunction, letting me know it could be processed quickly, depending on the court's schedule. By early afternoon, she texted to say everything had been submitted. The confirmation made my shoulders relax in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I closed my laptop and let out a long breath. Jenna looked over from the kitchen where she was rinsing dishes and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I nodded, feeling the need for fresh air. We stepped outside into a crisp spring afternoon, the kind where the sun felt warm, but the breeze still carried a bite. The sidewalks were lined with budding trees, small signs of the changing season. We walked quietly past storefronts and toward the river, the water shimmering under the light. I told her I wasn't sure what the next few days would bring, and she listened, hands tucked in her coat pockets, matching her pace to mine. When we reached the footbridge, we paused to watch a pair of ducks glide across the surface. After a while, Jenna turned to me and said, "Whatever comes next, you aren't doing this alone." Later that evening, back at her apartment, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity nudged me forward. A man's voice introduced himself as David Cole, an attorney representing my mother. His tone was controlled, each word measured, as he said he was reaching out to clarify the situation with the Riverview property. I listened without interrupting, as he mentioned the misunderstandings that may have occurred and suggested we discuss a peaceful resolution. When he paused, I told him calmly that all communications should go through my attorney, and I provided him with Elise's information. He tried once more to keep me on the call, but I repeated myself. By the time I hung up, the room around me felt still again. Jenna looked up from the stove where she was making a simple dinner for both of us. "Everything okay?" she asked. I walked over and leaned against the counter. "My mother's attorney," I said. "He wants to talk." She handed me a wooden spoon. "But he'll talk to Elise." I nodded. It felt like a small step, but a firm one, and it helped steady something inside me. As we ate, the conversation drifted to lighter topics for a while, giving my mind a brief break from the constant hum of the day. After dinner, I folded the blanket on the pull-out couch again and prepared to settle in for the night. The apartment window looked out toward the distant lights of Riverview, small and steady against the dark. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The certainty of what I had discovered earlier that day still lingered, and the memory of the 3 trash bags lined up against the shrubs remained vivid. Somewhere in that mix of details and unfinished conversations, I felt a slow shift, a quiet understanding that I hadn't reached the heart of the matter yet. When I finally lay down, the couch felt softer than it had the night before. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen blended with the faint sound of traffic outside, creating a steady rhythm that made it easier to breathe. I closed my eyes and pictured the documents on my laptop, the unexpected amounts, the unfamiliar names, the signatures that didn't align. The thoughts settled in slowly, like a thread pulling through fabric, and I knew the next step wasn't just about getting back into the house. Something deeper waited to be uncovered, something that had started long before the locks were changed. Sleep drifted in and out that night, never settling for long, and by the time a faint light crept across Jenna's living room, I was already awake. The apartment was quiet, the kind of early morning stillness that made every small sound feel louder. I lay there for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the muffled traffic beginning to stir outside. The uncertainty of the past 2 days hovered in the room, but beneath it was a steady focus I hadn't felt before. I folded the blanket, neatly tucked the pillow against the back of the couch, and walked toward the kitchen to find a glass of water. Jenna was still asleep, so I moved calmly, letting the morning come without rushing it. When she eventually stepped out of her room, her hair pulled back loosely, and her expression warm with sleep, she greeted me softly. I told her I needed to review the documents again, and she nodded, offering to make coffee before sitting at the table across from me. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the files this time, reading slowly and with intention. The numbers that felt strange the day before now stood out clearly, each detail connecting to the next with a quiet certainty. The checks signed to names that didn't belong to any known organization, the invoices without proper documentation, and the explanations my mother had given me that no longer aligned with what I was seeing. There was no part of it I could overlook now. I sent Elise a brief message asking when she was available to talk, and she responded within minutes. We arranged a call, and after a short while I stepped into Jenna's small balcony to take it. The air outside was cool, and I wrapped my hand around the railing while I listened to Elise outline the steps ahead. She spoke clearly, walking me through the injunction's progress and confirming that the letter had already been delivered to my mother. Her words were steady and factual, giving the moment a structure it had lacked before. When I mentioned the irregularities in the fund records, she asked if I could gather the documents in chronological order so she could begin a deeper review. I agreed and thanked her, then stayed on the balcony for a moment before going back inside. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I spread the files across the dining table, sorting them into neat piles, and Jenna sat beside me occasionally helping match numbers or dates. It wasn't hurried work, just careful and deliberate, and the more I looked through the pages, the more the pieces aligned. Each inconsistency created a clearer picture of what had been happening, and it helped settle something inside me that had been restless and unclear. By midday, I had everything organized, and I emailed the folder to Elise with a brief note explaining each section. After lunch, Jenna suggested we take a break, and we went for a calm walk around her neighborhood. The sky had turned a bright blue, and the trees lining the street were just beginning to bud. We talked lightly about everyday things, giving our minds space to settle, and by the time we circled back to her building, the tension in my chest felt less heavy. I thanked her for staying close through everything, and she smiled in that steady way she had, the kind that made the day feel more manageable. When we returned to the apartment, I checked my phone and found a voicemail from Elise asking if I could meet later in the afternoon to review some updates. I called her back and confirmed the time, then gathered my things. Jenna offered to drive me, but I told her I could manage, and she squeezed my shoulder before letting me go. The office building Elise used was downtown, a glass-fronted structure with a clean, quiet lobby. I took the elevator up and stepped into a conference room where she was already seated at the table reviewing a printed copy of the injunction request. She gestured for me to sit and walked me through the latest developments. The judge had reviewed the emergency filing and granted temporary access rights, which meant I could return to my home legally. Elise explained the next steps a locksmith would need to accompany us, along with a police officer, to ensure everything proceeded smoothly. She asked if I was prepared for that visit, and I nodded, resting my hands lightly on the table as she continued reviewing the details. After confirming everything, we set a time for the following morning. I thanked her and left the office with a quiet sense of direction. The sun was beginning to set behind the downtown buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. As I walked to my car, I paused for a moment, letting the evening air settle around me. There was no rush, no pressure to reach the next moment quickly. It felt important to move slowly to absorb the day as it was. That night back at Jenna's, we made a simple dinner and sat on the couch while a quiet movie played in the background. The room was warm and steady, and for the first time in several days, my shoulders relaxed fully. I knew the visit to the house the next day would bring its own set of challenges, but I felt ready for it. Before going to bed, I stood at the living room window, looking out at the soft glow of the streetlights. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause a moment to gather myself before taking the next step. When I finally lay down on the pull-out couch, the blanket tucked gently around me, I listened to the steady rhythm of the night settling outside. The documents, the phone calls, the small signs I had once overlooked, they all moved quietly through my thoughts, but without the sharpness they had carried before. I closed my eyes, knowing that morning would bring the return to my house, and with it the beginning of something I hadn't yet named. Morning came quietly slipping through the blinds in thin lines of pale gold. I sat up on Jenna's pull-out couch and listened to the soft rhythm of her apartment settling into the day. The court had granted the injunction, and soon I would be standing at the door of my grandmother's house again, only this time with a locksmith and a police officer beside me. I took a moment to sit still before gathering my things, letting the quiet of the room anchor me. When Jenna came out of her bedroom, she gave me a reassuring nod, then walked to the kitchen to make coffee while I slipped on my shoes. Once we were both ready, she offered to drive me, and I accepted. The ride through Riverview was calm, the early light brushing across the roofs of familiar houses. When we reached the edge of my street, the house looked exactly as it always had from the outside, the cedar shingles catching a soft glow in the morning sun. A locksmith van was already parked at the curb, and a patrol car sat a few feet behind it. A uniformed officer stepped out as we approached, offering a polite greeting before asking my name. I confirmed it and handed over the court paperwork Elise had given me. He skimmed the pages, nodded, and motioned for the locksmith to begin. I stood on the walkway, hands in my coat pockets, watching as the locksmith knelt by the door. His tools clicked softly against the metal, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet morning. Jenna stood close beside me, her arms folded against the chill. The officer remained near the porch, giving the situation a calm, steady presence. When the deadbolt finally gave way, the locksmith stepped back and opened the door, slowly revealing the dim entryway beyond. For a moment, everything felt suspended. Then I took a breath, stepped forward, and crossed the threshold. The air inside was still and cold, untouched, in a way that felt unfamiliar. My eyes moved across the living room, and it took a moment to understand what I was looking at. The walls were bare, the shelves empty, and every surface that once held life and memory had been stripped clean. The copper pots were gone from the kitchen. The quilt that had hung above the stairs was missing, and the framed photographs that once lined the hallway had left rectangular shadows behind. I walked slowly from room to room, each space echoing with a quiet I didn't recognize. In the study where my grandmother's old desk once stood, the emptiness was more pronounced. The drawers were open and vacant. The journals she kept for decades nowhere in sight. The lamp I had repaired the ceramic owl she used as a paperweight, even the small basket she kept by the window for mail, all of it had been taken. I crouched near the corner of the room, pressing my fingertips lightly against the floorboards. The officer stood at a respectful distance near the doorway, his voice quiet as he spoke. "If items are missing, you can file a separate report," he said. "We'll document what we can today." I nodded and stood brushing my hands off gently as I walked back toward the front of the house. Jenna met me in the living room, her expression calm but attentive. She didn't speak right away, allowing the silence to settle between us. The house, once warm and full, now held only the faint scent of dust and echoes of what used to be here. I took a slow breath and looked toward the mantel where my grandmother's photo once rested. The empty space there felt sharp, yet familiar in a way I couldn't name. Elise arrived a short time later, carrying her phone and a small notebook. She moved through the rooms, taking careful pictures of each wall and surface. She asked a few quiet questions, confirming what had been here before and noting what was missing now. When she finished, she joined us in the living room. "This gives us a clear record," she said. "We'll move forward with it." I nodded, grateful for her steady presence. After the officers and locksmith were finished, they both wished me well before leaving. Their cars pulled away slowly, and the street grew quiet again. I stood in the front yard for a moment, looking at the house from the outside. It was unchanged in appearance, but stepping inside had shown me how much had shifted beneath the surface. Jenna touched my arm gently. "You want me to stay while you get settled?" she asked. I told her I'd be okay and thanked her for everything she'd done. She smiled softly, then walked to her car, giving a small wave before driving away. I returned inside and walked through each room again, taking in the emptiness. I didn't reach for solutions or plans. I simply moved through the house with a slow, steady pace, letting the quiet fill in the spaces where memories once lived. When I reached the living room again, I set my bag on the floor and looked at the mantel one more time. Later, I would bring in things that mattered and begin making the space feel like a home again, but for now, I allowed the stillness to exist. That afternoon, Elise called to check in. I told her we had documented everything, and she said she would prepare the next steps. Her voice remained measured and clear, outlining the process we would follow and assuring me she would handle communications with my mother's attorney. I thanked her before ending the call. As the hours passed, the light inside shifted from bright afternoon to soft evening. I opened a few windows to air out the rooms, letting a gentle breeze move through the space. The house creaked lightly, as if adjusting to the change the same way it always had when the temperature shifted. I walked from one room to another, allowing my eyes to linger on each corner and doorway. It wasn't the same, but some part of it still felt like mine. When dusk settled, I locked the front door and sat on the floor of the living room with my back against the wall. The quiet of the house pressed in gently, not heavy, but present. I thought about the steps that had brought me here, the locked door, the bags behind the shrubs, the documents on my laptop, and felt a calm resolve settle over me. There was still more to uncover, and I could sense that the next conversation would bring everything into clearer focus. As the last of the daylight faded, I exhaled slowly and looked toward the hallway where shadows gathered. Tomorrow would bring the meeting with my mother and her attorney, and whatever came from that would set the path forward. I woke up early the next morning, long before the sun reached the tops of the trees outside my bedroom window. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into walls after a long absence, and I lay there for a moment, listening to the faint creaks that always came with the first shift of the day. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the soft light, and prepared myself for the meeting Elise had scheduled downtown. The conversation waiting for me wasn't one I had imagined ever having, but I felt steady as I gathered my things and locked the front door behind me. The drive into the city was calm, the road still mostly empty as the morning built itself around the skyline. When I reached the office building, Elise was already waiting in the lobby, her expression composed. She greeted me with a small nod and led me to the conference room on the third floor. The space was quiet, its glass walls reflecting the early light, and she motioned for me to sit beside her at the long table. A few minutes passed before the door opened again. My mother entered first, dressed in a tailored jacket, followed closely by Brian, who kept his eyes down as he took a seat. David Cole closed the door behind them and offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elise began by acknowledging the purpose of the meeting, her tone calm and steady. David responded with a similar formality, stating that his clients were interested in resolving the recent misunderstandings surrounding the Riverview property. He slid a document across the table in my direction, and I looked at it briefly before pushing it slightly toward Elise. She took it without comment and scanned the contents. He explained that access to the house would be restored and that any legal expenses I had incurred could be discussed, provided I agreed not to pursue any further claims involving the memorial fund or make public statements about internal family matters. My mother's gaze rested on me throughout his explanation, her arms folded loosely, as if she were waiting for me to accept what was placed in front of me. Brian remained quiet, tapping his thumb gently against the table. When David finished, the room settled into a suspended hush. Elise glanced at me, then closed the folder with a measured motion. I reached into my bag and pulled out the document Elise and I had prepared earlier that morning. I placed it in the center of the table, sliding it forward so it rested between us. "These are my conditions," I said, keeping my tone even. I didn't raise my voice or speak sharply. I simply stated each point as clearly as I could. Restoration of full access to the house, a written retraction of the statements made online, reimbursement for the expenses I had already documented, a signed agreement relinquishing any claim to the memorial fund, and a clear boundary requiring written permission before either of them stepped onto the property again. My mother leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to notice. "You're exaggerating," she said quietly. "This is unnecessary." Brian's shoulders tensed, though he still didn't look up. David cleared his throat and reminded the room that negotiation was possible, but Elise remained steady. "This is not a negotiation," she said. "This is a response to actions already taken." There was a pause long enough that the soft hum of the building's ventilation filled the room. My mother broke the silence first. "You're threatening your own family," she said, her voice low. I met her eyes. "I'm clarifying what I need in order to move forward." She looked away, then her jaw tightening. David asked for time to confer with his clients privately, and the three of them stepped out into the hallway. Elise and I stayed seated. She didn't speak right away, just rested her hands on the table and waited for me to breathe. "How are you feeling?" she asked after a moment. I nodded once. "Steady enough," I said. She gave a small nod in return. After several minutes, the door opened again. David walked in first, followed by my mother and Brian. Their expressions had shifted, though not in a way that carried relief or acceptance. It was more like resignation resting behind their eyes. David adjusted his glasses and said that his clients needed more time to review the conditions but were open to further discussion. Elise acknowledged his statement without committing to anything more. She gathered our documents and we stood to leave. As I walked out, my mother's voice stopped me. "Olivia," she said softer now. I turned, but she didn't continue. Instead, she looked toward the table as if the words had settled there instead of forming in the air. Brian stood behind her, his hands in his pockets. I gave a small nod before stepping into the hallway. The elevator ride down was quiet. When we reached the lobby, Elise reminded me to direct any further calls or messages to her. I thanked her again before heading toward the parking lot. The afternoon light was brighter now, settling over the city in soft layers. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the quiet surround me. When I returned to the house later that day, I walked through the rooms slowly, letting each step land with purpose. The emptiness inside no longer felt as sharp as it had the day before. Instead, it carried a different weight, one that allowed space for what might come next. I stood in the kitchen for a while, running my hand along the edge of the counter my grandmother used to lean against while drying dishes. A faint breeze drifted in from the open window, carrying the scent of the cedar trees that lined the property. Toward evening, I brought in the first thing I wanted to keep in the house. It was a framed photograph of my grandmother and me, taken at my college graduation. I set it gently on the mantel, centering it beneath the empty patch of wall where a larger painting once hung. The photo's edges caught the soft light from the window, giving the moment a quiet sense of grounding. As I stepped back to look at it, the room felt different. Not full, but no longer completely empty either. I pulled a chair from the corner and placed it near the window, letting the last of the daylight rest across the floorboards. The house didn't hold the same warmth it once had, but it held possibility. Later that night, I sat on the porch listening to the soft chirping of the crickets in the distance. The quiet wrapped around the neighborhood, settling into the edges of the evening. I thought about the meeting, the document on the table, the way my mother's voice had wavered when she called my name. There was still more ahead, more decisions and conversations to come, but something had shifted. The next step would bring clarity, and with it, the beginning of a new path. The following weeks passed with a steadiness I hadn't known in a long time. Each day began with small tasks, opening windows to let in the morning air, sweeping the hall where my grandmother once kept a woven rug, and placing a few of my belongings back into the corners of rooms that now felt both familiar and new. I bought simple furnishings as I could, nothing extravagant, just enough to bring a sense of life back into the spaces that had been emptied. With each change, the house settled around me in a way that felt patient, as if it understood the slow, careful pace I needed. During that time, I also reached out to a group of women I had met through a financial literacy program where I used to volunteer. Many of them were retired or starting over after significant life changes, and when I mentioned that I had space for small gatherings, they responded with warm curiosity. We held our first meeting in what used to be my grandmother's parlor. The room had only folding chairs and a borrowed coffee pot, but the conversation flowed with an ease that filled the space gently. We talked about budgeting, credit building, and preparing for unexpected expenses. As the women shared their experiences, I felt something steady forming in the room, an environment built on trust and persistence. Word spread quietly in the neighborhood. One afternoon, a woman named April stopped by with a plate of cookies and asked if her teenage daughter could receive guidance about applying for scholarships. Soon after, a neighbor slipped a handwritten note under my door explaining how my grandmother had once helped her through a difficult time. She wanted me to know that the work happening in the house honored what Maggie had built in her life. I kept the note in the top drawer of the new desk I had bought for the study. As the weeks unfolded, the house found its rhythm again. I repainted the kitchen in a pale yellow, reminiscent of how it looked when I was a child. I planted rosemary and sage outside the window, the scent drifting inside whenever I cooked. The study, once stripped bare, slowly took shape with bookshelves and soft lighting becoming a place where neighbors could sit to read or talk. I let the rooms evolve without rushing them, allowing the memories that lived in the walls to guide how the house grew around me. At work, things settled back into place as well. My manager called me into his office one morning to discuss a new client project, one that required precision and a calm approach. He explained that he wanted my perspective on it because he trusted how I handled difficult situations. I listened quietly, then agreed to take on the assignment. His confidence came with a quiet respect, something that made the long hours of the past weeks feel worthwhile. I returned to my desk that afternoon with a sense of grounded purpose. Through it all, Jenna remained close, stopping by with meals or offering to help rearrange furniture. Sometimes she stayed late into the evening, both of us sitting on the porch while the sky turned from pink to blue. She listened as I talked about the rebuilding of the house and the small milestones that made each day meaningful. Her presence had a way of bringing calm to even the most uncertain moments. During this period, my mother and Brian remained silent. There were no calls, no messages, no attempts to reach me. Elise updated me occasionally about the slow progress of negotiations, but the quiet from my family carried a weight that I learned to navigate. I let the silence settle without trying to interpret it, focusing instead on the steady work unfolding inside the house. One late afternoon, after a workshop session had ended and the last of the folding chairs had been tucked away, I stood in the parlor alone. The room was filled with the soft glow of early evening, and the air held a slight warmth from the dozen conversations that had taken place earlier. I walked over to the mantel where my grandmother's photograph rested in its frame. The edges of the picture caught the fading light, giving the sense that she was still watching over the place she had cherished. I touched the side of the frame lightly and let the quiet settle in. For the first time since all of this began, the house didn't feel like something I needed to defend or reclaim. It felt like a space that had grown with me, adapting to the changes in my life without losing the memory of what had been here before. The sense of waiting that once filled the rooms had lifted, replaced by a gentle steadiness. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner in the kitchen, I noticed the shadows lengthening across the floor. I paused at the counter to look out the window at the blooming rosemary. The sound of footsteps on the walkway reached me, then soft but distinct. I turned off the stove and walked to the front door, opening it slowly. Two figures stood just beyond the gate, their outlines familiar in the dimming light. My mother held her purse close to her side, and Brian shifted his weight uneasily. They didn't approach the porch. They simply waited there as if unsure of their place. My mother called my name, her voice gentle, but I didn't step outside. I watched them from the top step, letting the moment unfold without rushing into it. She spoke first, mentioning the work I'd been doing with the community and how she had heard about the gatherings in the house. Her words were careful, almost hesitant. Brian added that they had been thinking about how things had unfolded and wondered if there was a way to start fresh. The air between us held a quiet tension, their presence unexpected after weeks of stillness. I listened, letting each word settle, then took a slow breath. The house behind me felt warm, the rooms illuminated with soft evening light. I kept one hand on the doorframe as I answered them, steady and clear, aware that something important was shifting in the space between us. Whatever came next would define the path forward, not only for me, but for all of us. My hand rested lightly on the doorframe as I looked at my mother and brother standing at the edge of the walkway. The fading light fell across the lilac bushes that framed the gate, casting soft shadows along the path. Neither of them moved any closer. My mother held her purse close to her side, and Brian shifted his weight as if searching for the right way to stand. They both seemed smaller than I remembered, quieter somehow. When my mother spoke, her voice carried a gentleness I hadn't heard in years. She mentioned the gatherings at the house, the workshops, the neighbors who had been stopping by. She said my grandmother would have appreciated the changes, then added that they hoped to begin again. Her words hung in the air, careful and tentative, waiting for something from me. I stayed where I was, letting the moment settle before answering. The house behind me felt warm, the lights in the parlor casting a soft glow across the living room. I didn't raise my voice or step down from the porch. I simply told them the truth, that what had happened had left a mark, and rebuilding would look very different than it once did. My mother blinked, her expression unsure, while Brian lowered his eyes toward the path. I told them I wished them well and meant it, but the space I had created here, the people inside it, and the peace I felt were things I wasn't willing to compromise. They nodded without arguing, as if the words they had come to speak had already taken them to their limit. When they turned to leave, they did so slowly, their steps quiet along the walkway as the last of the daylight slipped behind the trees. I closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the calm inside the house. The rooms held a quiet warmth, the kind that came from something steady rather than something nostalgic. I walked back to the parlor where a few dishes from the workshop earlier still sat on the table. The last traces of laughter lingered faintly in the air, and the house seemed to breathe with a soft ease. I gathered the plates, washed them carefully, and dried them with a towel I had folded neatly at the counter. These simple tasks, done in the same kitchen where my grandmother used to hum while she cooked, brought a kind of grounding that felt right. When everything was clean, I went to the mantel and straightened the frame, holding my grandmother's photo. The smile in that picture carried the same calm strength I had felt so many times in her presence. I ran my fingertip lightly along the edge of the frame, remembering all the afternoons we spent in this house while she told stories or listened to mine. I hoped she would have been proud of the way this space had grown again, not through possessions, but through purpose and community. That night I sat in the reading chair near the fireplace with a soft blanket draped across my lap. The room was quiet, except for the occasional creak from the floorboards, the same familiar sound I used to hear as a child. I looked around and saw the small changes I had made, the bookshelves lined with titles neighbors had donated, the lamp Jenna had helped me carry, in the woven rug placed near the window where the light fell in the morning. Nothing was extravagant yet. Every piece felt chosen with intention. As the night deepened, a quiet understanding settled over me. I realized that reclaiming the house had never been about proving something to anyone. It had been about honoring a promise to my grandmother, to the younger version of myself, who once found comfort here, and to the woman I had become after everything was stripped away. The injustice that once felt overwhelming no longer held power over me. Standing my ground, setting boundaries, and rebuilding on my own terms had brought me a sense of peace that couldn't be taken or given by anyone else. In the weeks that followed, the workshops grew, and more people came through the door carrying their own stories, hopes, and questions. The house shifted in small ways with each gathering, its rooms filled with new voices and the warmth of shared experience. I found a deeper rhythm in my work, too, speaking up more in meetings and taking on projects that challenged me. My days felt balanced and whole, and when I came home each evening, the cedar siding of the house caught the light in a way that reminded me of all the seasons it had weathered. One quiet evening near the end of spring, I stood on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the river. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary from the garden below, and the sky faded slowly into a soft blue. I felt a calm sense of completion, not because everything was perfect, but because I had chosen a path that felt true. The house, once emptied and silent, had become a place of purpose again, one built on resilience, steady steps, and a kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. As I turned to go inside, I thought about the message I hoped others might take from my story. Life has a way of unveiling who we become when we're asked to stand alone for a while. Sometimes the door closes, not to shut us out, but to guide us toward what we're meant to build next. If my grandmother were sitting beside me, she would have reminded me that dignity lies not in what we hold on to, but in how we rise after loss. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of it reminded you of your own strength or your own quiet victories, I'd love to hear where it meets your life. Feel free to share your thoughts and join me again for the next story when you're ready.